No, I don't need the fire department, I said, pinching the bridge of my nose. The person on the other end of the line was doing a remarkable impression of a flustered sparrow. Well, not for putting out a fire, more for observing one. Appreciating it, really. It has a certain primal beauty. From my living room window, a shimmering column of orange fury was turning my backyard into a miniature sun and the frozen hellscape of my neighborhood into a very well-lit, frozen hellscape. Sir, the 911 operator chirped, her voice tight with panic. Is your property on fire? That's a very binary way of looking at it. I mused, swirling the lukewarm whiskey in my glass. Parts of it are definitely undergoing rapid exothermic oxidation. Other parts, less so. Look, can you just transfer me to my insurance provider? Just tell them to pull up my file. The one under Leo Maxwell. And maybe ask them if unscheduled, high-velocity thermal releases is covered under the Act of God clause, or if it falls under Act of Brenda. A confused silence. Act of Brenda, sir? She's the HOA president, so you know, close enough. Before the sparrow could ask any more questions, I hung up. The sirens were getting closer. This was going to be a long night. It had, after all, been a very long day. It all started, as most things do in Maple Creek Estates, with the weather and a tyrannical sense of order. 24 hours earlier, the sky had been the color of a dirty nickel, and the weatherman had been using words like generational and historic. For us, that meant ice. An ice storm of biblical proportions was bearing down on our little slice of suburban purgatory. Maple Creek Estates is where creativity goes to die. It's a master-planned community planned by someone whose master was a $50 beige color swatch. Every house is a slightly different shade of disappointment, from depressing taupe to aggressively bland. The lawns are manicured to within a millimeter of their life, the mailboxes are uniform, and the rules are thicker than a phone book and twice as boring. And the high priestess of this beige temple, the guardian of its sacred mediocrity, was Brenda. Brenda lived 2 doors down. She was a woman in her late 50s whose entire personality was wrapped up in her title, HOA president. She didn't walk, she patrolled. She didn't talk, she issued decrees. Last summer, I'd watched from this very window as she got on her hands and knees with a transparent ruler to measure my lawn. The next day, I received a formal violation notice, complete with photographic evidence. My grass, in one particular spot near the hydrangeas, was a full 1/4 inch over the 3-inch maximum mandated by bylaw 11.4a. So when the ice storm hit, I knew the power outage wasn't the real enemy. The real enemy was Brenda's inevitable, preemptive strike against comfort and common sense. The first fat, freezing drops began to fall around dusk. By 8 p.m., the world was encased in a perfect, glittering sheet of ice. Tree branches, groaning under the impossible weight, began to snap with cracks that sounded like rifle shots in the frozen air. Then, with a brilliant blue-green flash down the street and a collective groan from every appliance in my house, the lights went out. The silence that followed was absolute, profound, and very, very cold. My phone buzzed. It was my friend Mark, who lived a few towns over. Mark, power's out here. You guys get hit? Leo, power's out. Temp is 55 and dropping. I may have to burn my furniture for warmth. Starting with the IKEA bookshelf, it'll probably provide about 12 seconds of heat. Mark, you have that big generator, right? The one you bragged about? Leo, you underestimate the power of the dark side. I forwarded him the email Brenda had sent out yesterday morning. The subject line was, Urgent, Community Protocols for Impending Inclement Weather. To all residents of Maple Creek Estates, the bulletin began, in a font that managed to be both cheerful and threatening. In anticipation of potential power outages, please be reminded of Bylaw 8.6c regarding noise pollution. The use of non-approved fossil fuel power generators is a Level 3 violation, punishable by fines and public shaming on the community web portal. Let us all strive for a quiet and compliant storm experience. Mark, public shaming? Is that even legal? Leo, welcome to the jungle, baby. She governs with an iron fist and a laminated copy of the covenants, but don't you worry about me. I have a plan. Oh, I had a plan. A beautiful, complicated, and entirely necessary plan. I wasn't going to freeze, not on Brenda's watch. I was going to be warm. I was going to be ridiculously, gloriously warm. The first hour was a test of my resolve. I huddled under a mountain of blankets, my breath pluming in the air. My dog, a golden retriever named Hubble, seemed to think it was a fantastic new game and kept trying to burrow under the covers with me, his cold, wet nose a constant reminder of the misery outside. I lit a few candles, but they offered all the thermal comfort of a gnat's sigh. Besides, I remembered Brenda's addendum on that. Only single-wick, non-scented candles in approved glass containers are permitted during outages to maintain aesthetic consistency. I was pretty sure my skull-shaped candle holder from Halloween was a level 2 violation at least. This would not do. Conventional methods were for conventional people. I, Leo Maxwell, a man who once spent a weekend building a Rube Goldberg machine to water his single houseplant, was not a conventional person. It was time to activate Operation Toasty Freedom. I pulled on my boots, grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight, and headed for the backyard. There, behind my shed and artfully concealed by a row of evergreen shrubs, was my magnum opus. My masterpiece of off-grid defiance. To the untrained eye, it was just a big, white 100-gallon tank. But I knew what it was, the heart of my distributed ambient temperature regulation system. I'd procured the tank from a commercial grill supplier in the next state over, a man with a greasy ponytail and a deep appreciation for cash transactions. He'd asked if I was starting a barbecue cult. I told him it was for a performance art piece. He just grunted and helped me load it onto the truck. From the tank, a series of meticulously insulated copper pipes snaked along the back of my fence line. These weren't just pipes, they were the arteries of my system. They fed 3 powerful commercial-grade propane heaters I'd bought from a restaurant supply auction, the kind they use on outdoor patios at fancy bars. Of course, I'd retrofitted them to run on the much more efficient liquefied natural gas from the main tank. The real genius, though, was the camouflage. You can't just have 3 industrial heaters sitting in your backyard in Maple Creek Estates. That's a death sentence by HOA fine. So, I had encased each heater in a shell of welded sheet metal, creating what appeared to be 3 large, offensively ugly modern art sculptures. When Brenda had first inquired, I'd told her they were a commentary on the fragility of suburban ecosystems. This one, I'd said, pointing to the lumpy, angular monstrosity near the bird bath, is called Concrete Despair. And the tall, skinny one is Existential Longing. They're also functional. They help with drainage. The lie was so audacious, so utterly nonsensical, that she'd simply narrowed her eyes, made a note on her clipboard, and left. Victory through confusion. But the most crucial part of the system, the part that separated it from a simple bomb, was the brain. Each heater was equipped with an electric, thermostat-controlled igniter, and more importantly, a small electric fan at the base. The fan's job was critical. It ensured proper dispersal of the gas as it came out of the pipe, mixing it with the air to an optimal combustible ratio. It prevented the heavy LNG from pooling on the ground. The entire electrical system for the fans and igniters was wired to a single, dedicated circuit in my main house panel. As long as that circuit had power, the system was as safe as a kitten. A very, very warm kitten. Without the fans, well, you get a less optimal ratio. A much, much less optimal ratio. I made my final checks in the stinging, frozen air, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The pipes were solid. The tank pressure was good. I headed inside, flipped the breaker for the patio workshop circuit, and heard the faint, satisfying hum of the fans kicking on. A few moments later, the igniters clicked, and a gentle, blue flame blossomed inside each sculpture. A wave of radiant heat began to push back against the oppressive cold. I was back in my living room, starting to feel the first tendrils of glorious, artificial warmth creep into the room when I saw her. A shape, a silhouette against the icy backdrop. It was Brenda, flashlight in hand, standing at my fence line like a frost-covered gargoyle. "Leo," her voice cut through the wind. "What is going on over there?" I slid open my back door a crack. "Just enjoying the ambiance, Brenda? My thermal camera app is picking up significant heat signatures from your sculptures," she yelled, holding up her phone. Of course she had a thermal camera app. Of course she did. "It's part of the art," I yelled back. "It represents the inner fire of creativity struggling against the cold void of conformity. They're humming, and they're not on the approved list of decorative lawn features. That looks like unpermitted plumbing, Leo." "It's a closed-loop water feature," I countered, the lie coming easily. For birds who enjoy warm water. In ice storms, they're Scandinavian. She wasn't buying it. I could practically see the steam coming out of her ears, and it wasn't from the cold. She stood there for a long moment, the beam of her flashlight dancing over my sculptures, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated suspicion. Then she took out her phone, typed something furiously with her thumb, and marched back toward her house. I closed the door, a wide, smug grin on my face. Let her consult her bylaws. I'd read them. I knew the loopholes. I was warm, I was comfortable, and I was, for the first time all day, winning. An hour later, I was in heaven. The temperature inside my house had climbed to a balmy 70 degrees. I had shed my layers and was lounging on the sofa in a t-shirt and sweatpants, my laptop propped on my chest, streaming a movie thanks to the hotspot on my phone. Hubble was sprawled on the rug, fast asleep, twitching in some happy, warm dog dream. Outside, the world was a frozen nightmare. Inside, it was a tropical paradise. This wasn't just comfort, this was a victory lap. My phone buzzed. It was Gary, my next-door neighbor. Gary was a man who lived in a state of perpetual, low-grade panic. If a car backfired down the street, he assumed it was the start of the apocalypse. Gary, do you have power? I see lights. Your windows are glowing. Leo, not power, Gary, just superior engineering. Gary, Brenda is on the community page saying you've built some kind of illegal furnace. Is that true? Are we all going to die? Leo, relax, it's perfectly safe. And it's not a furnace, it's art. Tell Brenda to appreciate my aesthetic. I tossed the phone aside and leaned back, basking in the warm glow. That's when I saw it. Movement on the live feed from the security camera I had pointed at the side of my house. It was a figure in a thick, marshmallow-like white snowsuit. The gait was unmistakable. It was Brenda, and she was marching with the kind of grim determination usually reserved for Arctic explorers and tax auditors. She wasn't heading for my front door, she was heading for the electrical panel. My heart didn't sink, it didn't pound. Instead, a strange sense of calm, morbid curiosity washed over me. There are moments in life, I thought to myself, where you see a train coming and you know you're tied to the tracks, but you're not scared, you're just interested. You kind of want to see what happens when the train hits. This was one of those moments. I watched, utterly fascinated, as she reached the gray metal box on the side of my house. She fumbled with the latch. It was supposed to be padlocked. I'd taken the lock off last week to do some wiring and, in a rare moment of forgetfulness, hadn't put it back on. A tiny oversight. A fatal flaw in an otherwise perfect plan. She swung the metal door open. Her flashlight beam played over the neat rows of black switches, each one meticulously labeled in my own handwriting. Kitchen, living room, master bed, garage. And then, there it was, the one she was looking for. Patio, workshop. I watched her gloved finger rise. I watched it hesitate for a fraction of a second. And then, with a decisive, vicious flick, she snapped the breaker down. Inside my house, the gentle, reassuring hum from the backyard ceased. The silence was immediate and absolute. And so, the clock started. Brenda, in her infinite wisdom, had just performed amateur brain surgery on my beautiful creation. She had turned off the fans and the igniters to the brain, but not the brawn. The main valve at the tank was still wide open. The gas was still flowing. Silently, patiently, the heavy, vaporous LNG was no longer being dispersed and ignited. It was now just leaking, pooling, settling in a dense, invisible cloud around the base of my sculptures. I did a quick, fuzzy mental calculation. Flow rate, air temperature, dispersal volume. T-minus approximately 4 minutes, my brain supplied helpfully to what the insurance company will later call a significant thermal event. A slow smile spread across my face. I could have run outside. I could have screamed at her. I could have sprinted to the back and shut off the main valve. But where's the fun in that? Instead, I got up, grabbed my phone, and switched it to video mode. You just had to push it, Brenda, I whispered to the empty, wonderfully warm room. You just had to find out. I walked to the back window, thumb hovering over the record button, and waited. The first sign was subtle. The air above my sculptures, viewed through the double-paned glass of my patio door, began to shimmer. It was like the heat haze on a summer highway, but this was a haze born of pure, unadulterated fuel. A low, almost inaudible hiss seemed to permeate the air. My dog, Hubble, lifted his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He could smell it. Inside the house, the pilot light on my gas stove, which I'd used an hour ago to make tea and hadn't turned completely off, was doing its lonely job. It was just a tiny, flickering blue teardrop of flame, waiting. Gas vapor is heavy. It hugs the ground. And a small, steady leak from my heater farm had found its way to the house's foundation, seeping through a tiny, unsealed vent near the kitchen. A slow, invisible river of combustible gas was flowing right towards that little blue flame. I had the phone up, recording, my breath held tight in my chest. This was it. The grand finale. It wasn't a sharp boom, not like in the movies. It was a whoomph. A deep, guttural, world-ending whoomph that was felt as much as it was heard. The windows of my house bowed inward for a terrifying second, then bulged outward. A massive, roaring pillar of fire erupted from all three of my sculptures simultaneously. They merged into a single, cohesive column of churning orange and blue flame that rocketed 50 feet into the night sky, turning the icy darkness into brilliant, apocalyptic daylight. It wasn't an explosion. It was an ignition. A jet engine made of pure, unbridled chaos, roaring its defiance at the heavens. The spectacle of comedic destruction was instantaneous and breathtaking. Across the street, Gary's prize-winning snowman, a 6-foot-tall behemoth named Frosty Bartholomew that had won the community winter festival 3 years running, vaporized. It didn't melt. 1 second it was there, complete with its carrot nose and jaunty scarf. The next it was a puff of steam, a memory. Brenda's meticulously arranged collection of award-winning garden gnomes, which stood in a smug little line right on the property line, met a similar fate. They were flash-fired, their cheerful, painted smiles scorched into blackened, screaming visages of ceramic agony. One of them, a portly fellow holding a fishing rod, actually exploded, sending clay shrapnel across my newly singed lawn. The thick, glittering ice that had encased my roof, my trees, and my entire backyard didn't stand a chance. It vanished in a colossal, hissing cloud of steam, revealing blessedly clear shingles and bewildered-looking branches. For a brief moment, my property was the only ice-free zone in a 10-mile radius. For a full 3 seconds, there was a stunned, holy silence, broken only by the dragon's roar of the fire. Then, the neighborhood erupted. Car alarms, triggered by the pressure wave, began their pathetic, wailing chorus. Lights flicked on in every window. Doors flew open. People, bundled in coats and robes, poured out onto their lawns, their faces illuminated by the inferno in my backyard, their mouths hanging open in disbelief. My neighbor Sharon was already on her front porch, phone held aloft in landscape mode, her face a mask of grim journalistic determination. She was live streaming to the Maple Creek Estates community Facebook page. I could almost hear her breathless commentary from here. And Brenda? Brenda was still standing by my circuit breaker box, her ridiculous white snowsuit making her look like a stunned marshmallow. Her flashlight had dropped to the ground. Her mouth was agape. Her face, bathed in the demonic glow of the fire she had personally birthed, was a perfect portrait of shock and dawning horror. She had poked the bear. And the bear, it turned out, was full of liquefied natural gas. The first patrol car arrived in under 3 minutes, which was impressive. It slid to a halt at the curb, its blue and red lights painting the scene in strokes of frantic color that barely registered against the overwhelming orange of the fire. 2 officers got out, their expressions hidden by the glare. One of them just stood there, staring. The other started walking towards my house, with a purpose that suggested she was the designated adult in this situation. I met them at the front door, taking a moment to compose my face into what I hoped was a look of concerned but responsible homeowner. The male officer, whose name tag read Peterson, pointed a trembling finger towards my backyard. His jaw was working, but no words were coming out. It was his partner, Officer Ramirez, who spoke first. Her voice was calm, controlled, and utterly exhausted, as if she'd been expecting this all night. "Sir," she began, her eyes locked on the pillar of flame. Can you tell me what's happening?" "Good evening, officers," I said politely. "Bit of a cold snap, isn't it?" Peterson finally found his voice. "Sir, what the hell is that?" "That," I said with a dismissive wave of my hand, is my bespoke ambient temperature regulation system. There appears to have been a minor, unscheduled ignition. Nothing to worry about. Ramirez turned to look at me, her expression deadpan. An unscheduled ignition? Sir, your backyard is currently a leading contestant for the surface of the sun. It's LNG, I explained calmly. It'll burn itself out once the pressure in the tank drops. Probably. Look, the real crime here is what she did. I pointed an accusatory finger across the lawn at Brenda, who, having rebooted from her initial shock, was now trying to sneak away behind a frozen shrub. Ma'am, police, stay right there. Ramirez's voice was sharp now, cutting through the roar of the fire. Brenda froze, looking like a deer caught in the headlights of a freight train. Ramirez marched over to her, with Peterson following like a bewildered duckling. I, of course, followed them, staying on my own property but close enough to enjoy the show. Ma'am, did you have something to do with this? Ramirez asked. Brenda immediately went on the offensive. She was a cornered animal, and her only defense was her binder. She somehow produced it from inside her snowsuit, a laminated shield against reason. Officer, I was enforcing HOA bylaw 17.3, she declared, her voice shrill. It strictly prohibits unapproved external electrical modifications. His fire-breathing sculptures were drawing unauthorized power from his main panel. It's a clear violation. Ramirez stared at her. Ma'am, let me get this straight. You saw the fire-breathing sculptures? And your response was to go to his electrical box and turn off the power? Yes, to stop the violation. And then, Ramirez continued, her voice dangerously quiet. The giant fireball happened? Correlation does not imply causation, Brenda shrieked, waving the binder menacingly. He is the one with the illegal propane death machine in his yard. I was acting in the interest of community safety. I couldn't help myself. I shouted from my porch, cupping my hands around my mouth. It's LNG, not propane. There's a significant difference in thermal efficiency, and it was a perfectly legal and safe art installation until she tampered with the safety features. Peterson just looked back and forth between the three of us, then up at the roaring flame, then back at his partner. So, who do I write the ticket to? He asked weakly. Ramirez shot him a look that could have frozen the fire. This was clearly going to be a long, beautiful night. Just as Peterson was asking if anyone had marshmallows, the piercing wail of a much larger siren announced the arrival of the cavalry. A massive fire truck, lights blazing, navigated the narrow, ice-slick street and pulled up behind the patrol car. A team of grim-faced firefighters spilled out, hauling hoses and axes, ready to do battle. A man with a magnificent mustache and battalion chief written on his helmet strode onto my lawn and took in the scene. He looked at the 50-foot pillar of flame, then at the frozen houses, then at me. What have we got? He barked. LNG, I said. 100-gallon tank, direct feed. It'll burn itself out. The chief nodded, his professional calm a thing of beauty. He understood. You don't fight a gas fire with water. You just make a bigger, angrier, steamier fire. He turned to his men. Secure the perimeter! Keep everyone back 100 yards. We're just going to let her burn, boys. Nothing to see here. The firefighters, looking vaguely disappointed that they wouldn't get to spray anything, began unspooling yellow tape. The sense of absurd impotence was magnificent. The combined emergency services of my town had been reduced to spectators at my backyard barbecue. This was progress, but I needed an expert, a voice of reason, a man who could translate this beautiful disaster into language even a cop like Peterson could understand. I pulled out my phone and dialed the only man for the job. Dale. The phone rang 3 times before he picked up. His voice was gravelly with sleep. Yeah? Hey Dale, it's Leo. Got a bit of a situation here. I heard a long, tired sigh on the other end. What'd you do now, Leo? Try to network your toaster to the International Space Station again? Something a little bigger, I said, watching a piece of my fence catch fire. How do you feel about gas fires? Specifically, one that is currently taking place in my backyard and is potentially visible from space. There was a long pause. I'm putting my boots on. 20 minutes later, Dale's beat-up Ford F-150 rattled down the street, parting the sea of gawking neighbors. Dale got out, a man in his 60s, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the sun. He took a long, slow look at the pillar of flame, his expression unchanging. He looked at the police cars. He looked at the fire truck. He looked at Brenda, who was now trying to explain the legal definition of common nuisance to a stone-faced Officer Ramirez. Finally, his eyes landed on me. He took off his worn baseball cap and scratched his bald head. "Well," he said, his voice a deadpan rumble, "you finally did it." "Did what?" I asked, trying to sound innocent. "Achieved whatever this is," he said, gesturing at the inferno with his hat. "Congratulations, Leo. You've weaponized your lawn." I led him over to the officers. "Officers, this is Dale. He's my contractor. He understands the intricacies of the system." Ramirez looked Dale up and down, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Sir, can you explain this in a way that doesn't involve the words bespoke or art?" Dale nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the melted remains of my sculptures. "It's simple," he began, his voice carrying over the roar. "Kid here built himself a fancy heating system, too fancy. Got these big heaters hooked up to that gas tank." He pointed at the white tank, which was now glowing faintly. "The important part ain't the heaters, it's the little electric fans at the bottom of them. They blow the gas around, mix it with air so it burns clean and safe." He then turned and pointed a thick, calloused finger directly at Brenda. "She," he said, his voice dripping with the disappointment of a man who has seen the pinnacle of human stupidity, "turned off the power to the fans, but the gas was still flowing. So for about 4 minutes, this whole backyard was filling up with a big old invisible cloud of rocket fuel." He looked back at Ramirez. "It's like, you got a fancy new race car, and she thought the brakes were using too much brake fluid, so to save a buck, she just cut the brake line. The car was perfectly fine, right up until the moment you had to, stop." A beautiful, profound silence fell over our little group. Even the fire seemed to roar a little less loudly. Peterson's mouth was hanging open again. Ramirez slowly closed her notepad. "So," she said, looking at Brenda with newfound clarity, "you crashed the car." Brenda's face crumpled. For the first time all night, she was speechless. As Dale had predicted, the fire began to die. The glorious 50-foot pillar of defiance shrank, sputtered, and finally, with a soft poof, extinguished itself. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the initial ignition. The only sounds left were the crackle of my smoldering fence and the collective sigh of 50 neighbors. The aftermath was a study in monochromatic destruction. My once green lawn was a circle of blackened, smoking earth. The 3 sculptures were melted, twisted lumps of metal, looking even more like bad modern art than they had before. The air smelled of burnt plastic, scorched earth, and shattered regulations. The legend, however, was just being born. It was time for the official statements. Officer Ramirez, looking as though she had aged 10 years in the last hour, flipped open her notepad with the grim resignation of a condemned woman. The scene that followed was a masterclass in conflicting realities. My statement was a thing of beauty. I gave a technically precise, smug, and entirely unhelpful account of the evening's events. The system was operating within expected parameters, I explained, until an unauthorized external actor initiated a shutdown of the primary safety subsystem. This action resulted in a rapid accumulation of uncombusted fuel vapor, which subsequently reached its lower explosive limit and underwent a spontaneous stoichiometric conversion upon contact with an external ignition source. Ramirez just wrote, "He says the lady did it." Brenda's statement was a masterpiece of deflection and self-martyrdom. I was acting as a concerned citizen and a duly elected official of this homeowners association, she declared, her voice trembling with manufactured righteousness. I observed a clear and present danger in unpermitted, high-powered heating apparatus, and I took decisive action to mitigate the threat. I am the victim here, a victim of a rogue pyrotechnics enthusiast who shows flagrant disregard for our community's safety and aesthetic standards. Ramirez wrote, "Lady says he did it." Gary, my perpetually terrified neighbor, was next. He was wrapped in a silver thermal blanket the paramedics had given him, even though the fire had made the ambient temperature about 80 degrees. "I saw a flash," he stammered, his eyes wide. "A huge flash. I thought it was North Korea." "I really did. I've been stockpiling canned goods for this very day. Do you think the fallout is bad?" "I have iodine tablets." Ramirez wrote, "Neighbor is nuts." Then came Sharon, the citizen journalist. She didn't give a statement so much as a social media report. My live stream peaked at 300 viewers, she announced proudly, showing Ramirez her phone. The engagement was off the charts. The top comment, with 20 likes, is "OMG Karen strikes again." The second is, "That's lit, fam. I've already been contacted by 3 viral video licensing agencies. Do you need the links for your evidence file?" Ramirez just sighed and wrote, "Everyone is nuts." Finally, Ramirez and Peterson conferred. I could see them through the window of their patrol car, their faces illuminated by the laptop screen. After a few minutes, Ramirez got out and walked over to me and Brenda, who were standing in a tense, silent standoff on the border of my scorched lawn. "All right," she said, closing her notepad for good. "Here's how this is going to go. We have determined that this situation is a cascade of spectacularly bad decisions. It's a civil matter. No clear crime was committed that we can prove without a team of engineers and a year of litigation." She looked at me. "You, stop building things that can be seen from orbit. You're getting a warning for creating a public nuisance." Then she turned to Brenda. "You, stop touching things that don't belong to you, ever. You're getting a warning for trespassing and tampering. Consider yourselves lucky. Now go home, all of you." With that, they got in their car and drove away, leaving us in the quiet, smoky, and deeply awkward aftermath of my victory. 2 days later, the power was back on. My house was warm, my internet was working, and the world had returned to a semblance of normalcy. The only reminders of the thermal incident were the giant black circle on my lawn and the fact that my house had become a minor local tourist attraction. Cars would slow down as they passed, their occupants pointing and whispering. Then, the email arrived. It was from the Maple Creek Estates HOA. The subject line was capitalized and menacing. Mandatory Emergency Community Meeting. The agenda was simple. 1. Opening remarks by President Brenda. 2. Presentation. The Lincoln Avenue thermal incident and associated bylaw violations. 3. Community vote on sanctions. 4. Closing remarks. This wasn't a meeting, it was an inquisition, and I was the guest of honor. The meeting was held in the community center, a building so profoundly beige it seemed to absorb light and happiness. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and suburban resentment. The entire neighborhood was there, packed into uncomfortable folding chairs. At the front of the room, Brenda stood behind a lectern, flanked by 2 other board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. She was in her element, a queen addressing her court. She began with a slideshow. The first slide was a picture of my house, pre-inferno. The next was a grainy screenshot from Sharon's live stream of the Pillar of Flame. "As you can see," Brenda began, her voice dripping with gravitas, "our community was placed in grave danger on the night of the ice storm. A danger posed by one man's reckless disregard for our rules, our safety, and our shared property values." She went on for 15 minutes, presenting a masterfully twisted narrative. She detailed every supposed violation, from the unapproved sculptures to the hazardous plumbing. She painted me as a mad scientist, a menace who had turned our quiet cul-de-sac into a tinderbox. Several of the older residents nodded along, their faces grim. Gary was hyperventilating into a paper bag. When she finished, she looked at me with a triumphant smirk. "The board proposes a fine of $5,000 and the immediate, professional removal of all non-compliant structures from Mr. Maxwell's property. We now open the floor for discussion before the vote." This was my cue. I stood up and walked to the front of the room. I was holding a folder. "Thank you, Brenda," I said, my voice calm and clear. "That was a very creative presentation. However, I believe you've overlooked a few key details." I turned to the assembled homeowners. "And for my presentation, I've brought a guest." On cue, the back door opened and Dale walked in, looking deeply unimpressed with the beige decor. He ambled to the front and stood beside me. A murmur went through the crowd. They all knew Dale. He'd fixed every leaky faucet and squeaky door in this neighborhood for 20 years. His word was gospel. "First," I began, pulling a document from my folder, "let's talk about the bylaws. Brenda, you cited bylaw 17.3, prohibiting unapproved electrical modifications. But my system wasn't primarily electrical. It was a gas-powered thermal system. The electrical components were merely for ignition and safety ancillary systems. The bylaws, as you know, are conspicuously silent on gas-powered art." I continued, my voice resonating with the smug satisfaction of a lawyer who's found the perfect loophole. "You mentioned the structures. Bylaw 9.1 prohibits unapproved permanent structures. These were, by my definition as the artist, temporary artistic installations. There's no bylaw regulating temporary art, is there? Brenda's face was turning a fascinating shade of plum. But that's all legal nonsense, I said, tossing the papers onto the lectern. Let's talk about what really happened. Dale? Dale stepped forward. Evenin', folks, he grumbled. He then proceeded, in his simple, no-nonsense language, to explain exactly what he'd told the police. He talked about the fans, the gas, and the pooling vapor. Then he delivered the masterstroke. Look, I ain't a fancy engineer, he said, making eye contact with the neighbors. But I know this. Leo's setup was weird. Maybe it was stupid, but it was working. It was safe. The only thing that made it dangerous was her. He pointed at Brenda. She went onto his property, messed with his equipment, and turned a working heater into a bomb. It's that simple. She crashed the car to give him a ticket for speeding. A wave of understanding rippled through the room. The narrative had shifted. Sharon raised her hand. Brenda, she said, her phone already recording. I'm looking at the comments from my live stream, and a fire marshal from Cleveland commented that cutting power to safety ventilation on a gas appliance is criminally negligent. Do you have a response to that? Gary stood up, holding his paper bag. I've had to schedule 2 extra therapy sessions because of this. The sound of the woomph haunts me. The tide had turned completely. The neighbors weren't scared of my heaters anymore. They were angry at Brenda's tyrannical incompetence. They were angry about the national embarrassment, the scorched earth, and the fact that she had put them all at risk through her petty crusade. The meeting devolved into chaos, with everyone shouting at Brenda, who stood there, her authority stripped away, her face a mask of crumbling disbelief. The fallout was swift and merciless. An emergency vote was held on the spot. Brenda was not only voted out of the presidency, but off the HOA board entirely. The $5,000 fine against me was laughed out of the room. In a final, delicious twist of irony, the board voted to levy a special assessment for reputational and property damage to pay for the professional restoration of my lawn and the common area fence. And since Brenda was a homeowner, she had to pay her share. A few days later, Dale was in my backyard, overseeing a landscaping crew that was laying down fresh sod. I handed him a check. This is for the work, I said. And this part is your expert disaster consulting and public humiliation fee. He took the check, folded it, and put it in his pocket without looking at it. So, he said, staring at the fresh green grass, you gonna try to build a small-scale nuclear reactor to heat the pool next? Don't be ridiculous, Dale, I said with a scoff. The city regulations on acquiring and storing fissionable materials are a bureaucratic nightmare. Now, geothermal, on the other hand, the initial drilling is pricey, but the long-term ROI is fantastic. Dale just slowly shook his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. He tipped his cap and walked away without another word. Weeks later, life in Maple Creek Estates had returned to its normal, placid rhythm, but with a new undercurrent. My scorched earth victory had become local legend. I was the guy who fought the HOA and won with a pillar of fire. The neighborhood kids called me Fire Lord. I didn't discourage it. I was sitting in my home office, working, the house a comfortable 72 degrees. I glanced out the back window. The new grass was growing in nicely, but if you looked closely, you could still see a faint, circular outline, a slightly different shade of green, a permanent scar, a monument to my victory. My computer dinged. It was a new notification from the Maple Creek Estates community portal. Gary, in all his anxious glory, had been elected the new HOA president, mostly because no one else wanted the job. I clicked the link. It was a community poll. Subject: Proposed new bylaw 22.7. Please vote. It is proposed that all backyard art, temporary or permanent, must be certified non-flammable by a licensed third-party inspector. I chuckled, a low, satisfied sound. I archived the notification without voting and took a long, slow sip of my coffee. Amateurs, I thought to myself, a smile spreading across my face. They're trying to regulate the art. They should be regulating the people with the wire cutters.